cognitive theories. So you may have noticed that that learning video was really quite long, the drive reduction one just before. This is going to be the other long one out of this, but the shortness of the other videos and the fact that there are only 5 will compensate for this as we go along. So, like I said before, the behaviorist perspectives bleed over into this just a little bit. So, in addition to the influences that the behaviorists had on the various drive theories and the drive reduction theory, they also had some learning-specific approaches to it, not just that we learn, secondary drives from primary drives, things like this. The main one was incentive theory. So incentive theory, again, really just draws on the dynamics of operant conditioning to put together a theory of motivation based purely on, that idea of how much you've been reinforced, how much you've been punished. Incentive theory states that, and it's, again, considered the counterpoint for drive reduction theory. If you were a behaviorist back in the day, you thought that the entirety of motivation could be explained by combining drive reduction theory and incentive theory with each other, but we know nowadays that it's more complicated than that. But the notion of incentive theory is just the idea that some things are intrinsically desirable. These are your that when unconditioned stimuli give unconditioned responses, those primary drives, those immediate biological domains where you have an automatic reinforcing response to something, eating food when you're hungry, drinking water when you're thirsty, things like this. But the idea is also that you learn things secondhand, that through learning, in the same way that you learn secondary drives, you can just learn that certain objects in the world are intrinsically desirable. They become intrinsically desirable just because you've been reinforced for pursuing them, or you see a lot of messaging that implies that they have value. That kind of leads into the observational learning aspect of this. But that is basically what incentive theory is about. That certain things in the environment, especially a lot of things that have been targeted by advertising or that are very praised in social norms and things like this, are only points of motivation because we have learned passively from the environment that these are things of high value that are worth pursuing. If you want to really put the two theories together in that sense, the idea is that our drives push us towards particular behaviors. The incentives that we learn about the outside world pull us towards them. That was the push-pull metaphor that behaviorists used back in the day. But beyond that, that's taking some big strides into the cognitive area. But in the 1950s and 60s, there was the cognitive revolution, the new paradigm in psychology that really looked at things from an information processing and content perspective. So, like I said before, there are 3 main cognitive approaches, 3 main cognitive theories, I should say, that we're going to be looking at here, that when you put them together, especially in the order that they were discovered in, gives you this much richer sense of that middle area, that middle part of the flowchart that I had before, how we choose how to behave, how we think about what to do to get what we want, motivation-wise. So again, keeping in mind that the basic language of this that we're talking about here is this doesn't reflect implicit learning. This doesn't reflect some of those other things we were talking about where you're conditioned and things react purely on the level of the nervous system. The cognitive approaches are all about what you're consciously aware of, the processing in your mind that makes you make decisions that you are aware of. At least that's the focus that we're talking about here. So again, this is all about intentional goals. This is about how we decide what we're going to do, decide what we value, and then figure out ways to make it happen. So the most basic form of these are the goal-setting theories. Sometimes it's referred to just as goal-setting theory, but that would imply that it's a singular theory that had only one author once upon a time or something like this. But there were a bunch of theories that all basically said the same thing at the time. We just called them the goal-setting theories or goal-setting theory in retrospect. But the notion is that, well, what is a goal from the cognitive psychology perspective, like we were kind of hinting at earlier on in this lecture? A goal is just your imagined state of affairs, the way that you imagine the world to be and you like it. In that sense, all goals are about a desired, change in a state of affairs, some way you want the world to be different, picturing in your mind's eye, putting together that mental judgment of what this alternate perspective looks like, what this alternate world looks like. That is your goal. It's a mental representation in the cognitive language. And again, they can be unrealistic, they can be realistic, they can be very similar to our current circumstances, they can be, wildly different along the way. But again, the notion is imagining the world different from how it is now and realizing that you would like it better that way. That is the essence of setting a goal in goal-setting theory. Now, the cognitive function of this, the reason why imagining goals in this way is useful and why it is an adaptive thing for us to be able to do, as opposed to creatures that can't set goals in this conscious way that we do, is that it allows you to make cognitive comparisons between the world as you perceive it right now and the world that you have set your goal in, the way you wish for things to be. And those comparisons give you a cognitive basis to figure out what needs to change, what things could I strategically do to make the world as I know it more like the world as I desire it. What things could I potentially do, what favors could I ask, what tasks could I dedicate myself to that will make the world more like the way I wish it was. So I mean, when we think about goal-oriented behavior in that sense, we often have a metaphorical language of it. Like your goal is a point distant in space, and you're trying to get to it, and you're willing to shove people or obstacles out of the way or dodge around them in order to get to it. That's why a lot of people use sports metaphors for these sorts of things. But that is the essence of it. Now, you may be thinking, if goal-setting theory is all about that, a goal is, whatever I imagine I want the world to be, and then I try to compute how to get there. What about unrealistic goals? What about, I wish I lived on a spaceship or something like this, or I wish I was a famous film actor or something like this? They realized that goal-setting theory just didn't have enough nuance to it to explain why we are not permanently dedicated to just fanciful, implausible goals. So the next theory that was added on top of goal-setting theory in order to give us more perspective on this, in order to explain more of the phenomena of motivation, is expectancy value theory. So expectancy value theory explains that we do not equally value all of the different goals that we could imagine. We ascribe different levels of psychological value to our goals based on a couple of different things. The first being how desirable it is intrinsically, how good the state of affairs would be. We wish for, we're more drawn towards goals that are extra nice for us than we are goals which are only so-so. But the other main thing is we have to trade that off relative to the other things we value, the other things we want, and how we realistically parse that together. Just to give a quick example, somebody who has decided to go on a diet is motivated, and they've set themselves a goal, they imagine themselves being thinner and having better health outcomes, something like this. And even though they will experience drives that motivate them to contradict that goal, they'll experience hunger quite intensely and things like this, they have assigned greater psychological value, or at least they have if the diet is successful. They've assigned greater psychological value to this goal, this is the goal that they have set for themselves in the future, the diet goal, than the satiation of the immediate drives that they feel along the way. So, in terms of how this breaks down, the main thing is, the more desirable a goal is, the more we want to do it. That goes without saying. That was part of goal-setting theory as well. But expectancy value theory also lets us know that we dedicate ourselves more easily to goals. We actually intrinsically elevate how desirable or how much we're willing to commit, how much value we place in a particular goal, the more plausible it is. That is to say, the closer to our current circumstances it is, and therefore the more likely we are to be successful in pulling it off. It's why we don't all just dedicate ourselves to completely fanciful scenarios that we'd never be able to succeed at. And I apologize if you can hear the rainfall outside my window here. I've been putting off this recording a little bit, just trying to avoid the various thunderstorms in my area, but we'll see how this goes. So just to give a quick example of this, I may strongly desire, as I'm sure many of you have at some point in your life, the great social acclaim, wealth, and international fame that comes with being a successful Hollywood actor, with being the next Chris Pratt or Brad Pitt or something like this. And I may think, that's so desirable, that's a goal I would like to meet. The reason that most of us don't commit to that, certainly the reason I don't commit to something like that, is because via cognitively assessing my own situation, the demands of the world around me, and how far away that goal is, how different it is from the world as it exists right now, I deem it to be implausible. I deem it such that my efforts would not be able to bridge the gap between where I am and where I want to be, and that undermines the amount of psychological value I place in it. My expectation of how plausible it is changes the value of the goal itself. That's why we call this expectancy value theory. So, that's usually good. Expectancy value theory explains the processes in our mind that allow us to not just overcommit ourselves to completely fanciful, completely implausible goals. It allows us to manage our time well, although there is a dark side to this that we'll touch on a little bit later in the semester. A really good example of this, the darkest side of expectancy value theory, is if you are a member of a negatively stereotyped group, for example, and you hear a lot of messaging from the world about how much people like you cannot achieve in university or cannot do well in jobs or something like this, it may lead you to have a false perception, an unnaturally, or I should say, an artificially low conception of how likely you are to succeed at something you try at. So you might end up just not pursuing a bunch of things you could have otherwise achieved. It may undermine your motivation in meaningful ways just because you don't believe you can succeed at something because you've been told, you've been told the messaging of various negative stereotypes. This phenomenon is referred to as a stereotype threat. It's a special kind of performance anxiety relating to these social circumstances. We will touch on it again a bit later in the semester. But again, expectancy value theory isn't 100% good, It allows us to manage our behavior, to not overcommit to implausible things, but sometimes it also undercuts what's possible for us. So, this is an example I have in this slide here. Imagine you are a young woman of color and all the various connotations that come along with that. Various messaging that you receive in the environment, especially from racists and things like this, will be along the lines of, you're intellectually inferior, you're a woman, so you're overly emotional, you're not good at math or science, things like this. Again, that can just shape your expectations in such a way that you will give up prematurely on things you might have otherwise been capable of. The last theory within the cognitive theories that is really influential to the modern perspective is self-determination theory. So both goal-setting theory and expectancy value theory concern what we refer to as extrinsic motivation. That type of motivation that the behaviorists and even Freud as well were mostly concerned with, although Freud less so for reasons I'll describe. The idea that you are motivated because you want to get something. You do a behavior because you're interested in what will come out of that. It's again a very operant conditioning oriented way of looking at things. But self-determination theory, the theorists who came up with self-determination theory determined that that's not the only thing that we find rewarding about the environment. That's not the only reason we do the things that we do. A bunch of activities are also intrinsically motivating. So the difference here being you do extrinsically motivating things because, again, it's extrinsic, it's outside of you. You want some kind of outcome or goal or reward that comes at the end of it. That's the reason for your behavior. Whereas intrinsically motivating things are behaviors that you would perform because the actions in and of themselves are in some way rewarding or engaging. So again, you sometimes hear about this in occupational settings, the idea of your intrinsic goals versus your extrinsic goals, the things that are rewarding in and of themselves versus things that you do even though you don't like them or you have no positive sensation for them because you want what comes afterwards. Now, self-determination theory, the most useful thing that we get out of it isn't just the acknowledgement that both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation exist, but it gives us a perfect breakdown of what factors influence intrinsic motivation, under what circumstances we are likely to feel intrinsic motivation. There are three different ways in which a behavior can be intrinsically motivating. It can be through autonomy, that is to say, it is intrinsically rewarding for us to see our will have impact on the world around us, to feel like we are capable of doing things, that we are powerful, that the decisions we make matter. So the more you see your choices have an impact on the world, that is intrinsically rewarding, that is autonomy. There is competence, which is the flow sort of notion of saying that if I put some effort into something, will I succeed? If the answer is yes, that is intrinsically rewarding. We like to see the benefits of what we try. We like to feel that we are good at things. This relates to the Freudian psychodynamic concept of mastery. We like to think, if I put effort in, will I get results? Even if the results aren't, immediately reinforcing or anything like this, just seeing that you can do things well, seeing that you have some degree of mastery over how well you can do things, that your effort pays off, that is intrinsically rewarding as well. And the last one is relatedness, is this notion that anytime you are doing an activity that gives you a communal sensibility, it gives you the sense that your experience is shared with other people, it lets you feel related to others in that sense, that is intrinsically rewarding as well. This is why so many things are more fun to do in groups than they would be by yourself. The action itself is transformed, and you feel intrinsically motivated when doing that action connects you to other people of similar circumstances. Now, this is something that Jordan's applied lectures are going to go into some detail on, the idea of, as allied health professionals, how do you structure activities or exercises or tasks for your clients to maximize that amount of intrinsic motivation. The more intrinsically motivated they are, the better their outcomes will be, the more they will stick to what they're doing because they're more motivated. So how can you make people feel like their decisions matter? How can you make people feel that they will get progress out of applying effort to something? And how can you put them into a circumstance? This is why there's a lot of group work done in allied health contexts and support groups and things like this. How can you make people feel that they share their experience with other people under similar circumstances? Now, one important thing to take out of this, though, and again, it's one of the important reasons why we learn the direct psychological theory of this, instead of just describing the broad strokes of it and sending you all out into the world that way. Extrinsic and intrinsic motivation are not completely independent of each other. There are various ways in which they interact. The most important one being that extrinsic motivation, getting an external reward for the completion of a task or something like this, actually undermines a task which is also intrinsically motivating. It undermines that intrinsic motivation. To give my favorite example of this in a real-world experiment, they find that little kids like to color in with textures, like with markers or crayons or whatever if you give it to them. Kids just love coloring in because it's intrinsically motivating. It's an activity that's fun, they can see their effort being applied, they can compare drawings with each other, it's a good time. If you take a bunch of kids, just give them crayons or textures or whatever, they will just draw to their heart's content. If, however, and they found this in this experiment, if you give them a reward for every page of coloring in that they do, let's say, you give them candy for every page of coloring in or every drawing that they complete, they will be extra excited about this. Now they have intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. It's win-win. They'll produce a lot more drawings. But then if you take those same kids and say, okay, I'm not going to give you candy anymore. There's no more extrinsic reward anymore, but you can still draw if you just find it fun. They don't find it fun anymore. The intrinsic motivation is undermined by being attached to an extrinsic motivation. That's a very important thing to keep in mind. There's a famous saying that people say, which is, do something that you love and you'll never work a day in your life. Well, that's not true. Because if you are being rewarded, if you are being paid to do something that you love, when that pay goes away, it's not something that you love under the same terms anymore. The extrinsic motivation trumps the intrinsic motivation, and even if it was enjoyable at the time, it has become work, and it won't be enjoyable anymore. This is an important thing to keep in mind about not over-rewarding people when you do allied health tasks with them as well, because rewarding things that don't need to be rewarded means that they are less likely to keep doing those things in the absence of those rewards. That's intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, self-determination theory. So this brings us to the final perspective on this. So you see I've added the cognition block in the middle. That's how we figure out how to approach satisfying our drives, how to get our goals seen to. So we already know drives, we know most of behavior already. The cognitive perspectives give us an idea of, well, psychodynamics contributes to the idea that we have to interpret our drive feelings. How do we do that? Well, we can set specific goals as imagined mental states. We have beliefs of plausibility. We have expectations as to how likely something is. That determines how much value we put into a particular course of action. We plan what to change by comparing ideal circumstances to the world as we see it right now. And the goal values will vary based both on how much we want it and how likely we think it is, and of course, how much opportunity for intrinsic motivation there is along the way, or intrinsic rewards. So that's what we add to behavior as well. We're more likely to do things that have more intrinsic motivation. And I have added a little feedback sort of arrow here, because going forward, the behaviors that successfully satiate our drives and give us a sense of reward that allow us to achieve our goals, these are the things that feed back on our cognitive conception. This is the learning aspect. Whenever we evaluate that we have succeeded, we do more of that kind of strategy in the future. So that brings us to the end of the big sections. Next up, the humanistic approach. I'll see you all there.